works as an assistant professor and director of integrated studies at Northern New Mexico College. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Dr. Bashara.
Thank you so much, Mohammed, and thanks for the organizers for inviting me. I appreciate it. So I'm going to share some slides here. Are you all able to see my screen? Okay, so yeah, the title of my talk today is Double Unconsciousness. And basically, I'm going to talk about it in terms of subjectivity, but also in terms of otherness. So my aim is to historicize and theorize the modern unconscious vis-a-vis colonialism, as well as coloniality. And I define coloniality as the psychic remainder of colonialism. So even though colonialism continues to exist today as a material reality, it's not just an event that took place at some point in time. It's actually a structure that continues to exist in different forms. Coloniality speaks to the psychic aspect of that. So if you will, how colonialism affects our subjectivity. So my effort here is not simply to critique psychoanalysis, which I do, but more importantly, to world it. So this idea of worlding comes from Edward Said. And so in a sense, to make it more globally relevant, to think about it through a global lens, if possible. And I do this through an emphasis on this notion of exteriority, which is explored by multiple thinkers, Edward Said, Enrique Dussel, even Jacques Lacan has his own version of it with his concept of extimité or extimacy. So this intervention is a further development of some of my ideas in decolonial psychoanalysis, as well as Freud and Said. Those two books are connected theoretically, and you can think of this talk as kind of building on them and toward this third book that will complete the trilogy, which hopefully I'm planning to finish it by 2023, because I have two book contracts at the moment. So I have to finish those first and then start this one. So, but I already wrote parts of it. So it's exciting to present some of this work. So we begin with the other side of the cogito. Okay, the modern unconscious. So Columbus didn't discover the Americas in 1492. By the same token, Brouwer and Freud did not discover the unconscious in 1895. Freud himself is credited for writing or saying that the poets and the philosophers before me discovered the unconscious. What I discovered was the scientific method by which the unconscious can be studied. Freud, however, in other words, theorized the modern unconscious. That's what he did. Well, some attribute the invention of the unconscious to Schelling and Nietzsche, but Descartes undoubtedly provided the philosophical foundation for the modern unconscious. So there's a lot of kind of focus on that in this talk. This is kind of an interesting aside. Freud the Conquistador. So in a letter to Wilhelm Fliess on February 1st, 1900, Freud wrote, "I am by temperament nothing but a conquistador, an adventurer, if you want to translate it, with all the curiosity, daring, and tenacity characteristic of a man of this sort." So that's interesting for Freud to say this about himself. Now, of course, I don't read too much into this. However, it is an interesting metaphor that he uses as someone that, dedicated his life to interpretation, took language very seriously. So we have to kind of still think about the meaning of this metaphor for him. But one way to look at it is kind of further supportive of what I'm going to talk about in terms of this further division of subjectivity. So in a sense, Freud obviously, as a Jew living in an anti-Semitic milieu in Vienna, basically he experienced being racialized and being a minority, being an oppressed group, and he had to actually flee Austria because the Nazis annexed it. So there's that dimension of Freud, which Edward Said talks about as this non-European dimension of Freud. So it's the non-European dimension of his subjectivity, but also the non-European dimension of his theorizing, his writing, all of that. However, at the same time, and as subjects, as complex subjects, as divided subjects, we're full of contradictions, right? So there's that side, but there's also the side wherein he's identifying very clearly in this case with the conquistador, identifying with a European identity. In other words, trying to assimilate, trying to fit in, trying to be accepted. So this is a tension in his very being, but it's also a tension in his work, right? So I say this because sometimes people misread what I'm doing as some kind of cancellation of Freud, or but it's not about that. It's actually about understanding the complexity of the man, the complexity of his theorizing, and seeing how we can expand it further, right? Complexify it further, right? So that it speaks to us today. So the ideological discovery, in quotes, of material and psychic dark continents is a question of not only exploitation and alienation, but also accumulation and fungibility. So this is from Kara's wonderful book, Dark Continents. Psychoanalysis is a colonial discipline, she writes. A colonial intellectual formation disciplines a way of being as much as it establishes a form of analysis based in the age of colonialism and constitutive of concepts of the primitive against which the civilizing mission could establish itself. It brought into the world an idea of being that was dependent on colonial political and ontological relations, and through its disciplinary practices, formalized and perpetuated an idea of uncivilized, primitive, concealed, and timeless colonized peoples. As a discipline, it formalized strategies to normalize a form of civilized being constituted through colonial political dynamics. In the space between the earth and the colonizing world of late 19th century and early 20th century Europe, a national colonial self was brought into existence, or perhaps more accurately, into unconcealment, and it situated itself with fascination in opposition to its repressed, concealed, and mysterious dark continents, colonial Africa, women, and the primitive. So for Freud, he thought about women as the dark continent. For Columbus, it was supposedly going to India and then coming across the Americas, the so-called discovery, that becomes a dark continent, of course, with the age of imperialism later on, particularly in the 19th century. Africa becomes this dark continent that is basically could be overexploited, right? And then divided along these lines because of how imperial powers decided to divide it that way, right? So we have interesting parallels here. This is from the work of Justin Clemens, wherein he talks about this, how the concept of slavery is central in psychoanalysis, but it's basically symbolic slavery. This is what it is. So they never talk about anything except really symbolic slavery. So to kind of give you a sense of where that comes from, the legacy of this idea. So obviously Aristotle distinguished between natural slavery and political slavery. So for him, political slavery was basically living under tyranny, right? And so it's basically a form of symbolic slavery, right? Whereas natural slavery would be the actual material experience of slavery, or chattel slavery, right? So he made that distinction to say basically that some people, it's a kind of a developmental distinction. It's a hierarchical distinction. And this is something that's inherited throughout philosophy as a concept, and it's also inherited throughout politics. It still continues to this day. So a lot of reference to symbolic slavery as if actual slavery didn't take place, right? So we pay more attention to and emphasize symbolic slavery more. So another person, obviously, another philosopher that popularized this notion as Hegel and the phenomenology of spirit, the master-slave dialectic, which for him was a dialectic between ideas, which of course was inverted by Marx in a material sense, became a dialectic of classes, class struggle. For Lacan, it's a dialectic of signifiers. So he basically makes it about language, right? So when he talks about mastery and slavery, for him, it's a tension between a master signifier and S1. And sorry if this is too abstract, but this is kind of Lacanian algebraic formulas here. As you can see, the image, the S1 over the barred S. So the S1 for Lacan is the master signifier. This kind of formulation that we're looking at is what he called the master's discourse, which for him explains the logic of mastery as a kind of discourse, but also as a way of subjecting us in a certain way. And so the S2 for him, the slave in this case, is an abstract slave. He called it knowledge. So for Lacan, and this is again based on Hegel, and we can trace it back to Aristotle. And the S2, the knowledge, is always subservient to the master. And so he develops this further to say that the university, or philosophy more general, because he was an anti-philosopher in many ways, is subservient to mastery. So any kind of knowledge produced by the university is at the end to support the master, the S1. But the master for him is not necessarily a person. The master can be a person, but for him, more importantly, a master signifier. So basically a kind of word that, or concept that becomes so dominant for us that, you know, it's repeated a lot. It has some kind of effect on our subjectivity, right? Almost an irrational effect. So just to give you examples from contemporary use, freedom and democracy will be two big ones, right? They're master signifiers, repeated all the time, and horrible things happen in their name, right? But that's how master signifiers function. So anyways, I show this in a way to problematize how psychoanalysis overemphasizes symbolic slavery, but doesn't really historicize actual slavery. I find this a problem. So I asked the question, what of real slavery? Is that the repressed unconscious of psychoanalysis itself? A source of its jouissance or its enjoyment? This is a question that upsets the psychoanalytic establishment, if you will, even though there's no monolithic group. No matter what orientation you might have, just raising this question is disturbing. But the fact that it is disturbing is interesting. Why is it disturbing? Why is it anxiety provoking? Right? So I want you to think about this question. What if the real of slavery? Is that the repressed unconscious of psychoanalysis itself? Right? Because there's a lot of talk about symbolic slavery, no talk of real slavery. So we move here to the analyst's desire, and the formula that you see at the top right is basically Lacan's formula for the analyst's discourse. So the A represents the analyst in this case, and his point was to say that psychoanalysis is to be completely distinguished from the master's discourse. It's supposed to be something else. It functions with using a completely different logic, and there's something maybe liberating about that. And so you can see the A is the analyst, the bar subject would be the analysand, the one who's doing most of the analysis, basically, right? The one that's doing the work of free association. So Fink qualifies the analyst's desire as purified desire, or a desire that focuses on analysis and only on analysis. He also calls it the motor force of analysis. However, is the psychoanalytic clinic an acontextual space? Or is it a psychosocial space that is linked with what is going on materially and ideologically in the world? So that's my first question. My second question, is the practice of psychoanalysis ahistorical, or is it a function, an effect of a specific historical unfolding? You can kind of guess my answers here, right? I ask these questions in order to think about not only the analyst's desire, but also the jouissance of analysis, the enjoyment of analysis, which again is an uncomfortable question, which is rarely theorized. The metaphorization of slavery for example, seems to me like a defense against the traumatic real of slavery, which is not properly historicized in relation to psychoanalysis, right? So from the analyst's desire, we have to also think about the jouissance of analysis. And here Hartman, I think, provides us with a key to kind of think about that, wherein she writes, the relation between pleasure and the possession of slave property in both the figurative and literal senses can be explained in part by the fungibility of the slave, that is the joy made possible by virtue of the replaceability and interchangeability endemic to the commodity, and by the extensive capacities of property. That is the augmentation of the master subject through his embodiment in external objects and persons. Put differently, the fungibility of the commodity makes the captive body an abstract and empty vessel, vulnerable to the projection of others' feelings, ideas, desires, and values. And as property, the dispossessed body of the enslaved is the surrogate for the master's body, since it guarantees his disembodied universality and acts as the sign of his power and domination. Thus, while the beaten and mutilated body presumably establishes the brute materiality of existence, the materiality of suffering gradually eludes recognition by virtue of the bodies being replaced by other signs of value as well as other bodies. So you can see here this notion of disembodied universality, which is going to be a key thing for this conception of the cogito that Descartes comes up with, that ends up being foundational for psychoanalysis. And of course, this conception excludes other conceptions of thinking and being. And that's basically the key argument that I'm making here. So how did psychoanalysis get here? You might ask yourself. The subject, this is Zizek, he writes that the subject of psychoanalysis is none other than the Cartesian cogito. It's very clear, and he's not the only one to make this case. Many theorists today and from before made this argument that the Cartesian cogito, basically the thinking part of cogito ergo sum, that's the subject of psychoanalysis. And to explain that logic, if you look at the Venn diagram, now Descartes himself, when he made the famous, almost cliche statement, I think, therefore I am, or therefore I exist, basically it's kind of, from a psychoanalytic perspective, an ideal or phantasmatic statement about this perfect state of thinking and being perfectly aligning, right? So that's, in the Venn diagram, the two coming together, right? What psychoanalysis is interested in is actually how they don't come together. So the only reason Descartes is essential is because he thinks of that relationship. It's just they invert the relationship in their thinking, psychoanalysts. So they are interested in how thinking doesn't align with being and vice versa. So for them, they make a distinction, psychoanalysts make a distinction between false being or ego, which would be the equivalent of saying, I'm not thinking, being devoid of thought, right? And that's mastery from a psychoanalytic perspective, is to be a false being. Whereas the unconscious is on the side of thinking, but thinking without being. Unconscious subjectivity. So I am not, right? Now, of course, there are moments when the two come together, and those are the moments that Descartes talks about. But from a psychoanalytic perspective, these moments are rare. Most of the time, we're either this or that. Okay? So you might do something and you say, I don't know why I did that. Or you might say something and you say, I don't know why I said that. That's the reason. It's because thinking is divided from being, right? Following this, Mladen Dolar, also from the Ljubljana school, like Zizek, talks about three different cogitos, and he bases this on Lacan's register theory of the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. So he talks about the imaginary cogito was rejected as opposed to the mirror phase. It was seen as the support of an illusory self-transparency that the mirror phase could effectively dismantle. The symbolic cogito was taken as the best way to conceive the subject of the signifier and its relation to the unconscious. And then finally, the real cogito, the acephalic subject of drives. So that would be the image on the right. So there's kind of a way of thinking about the three different cogitos that align with Lacan's register theory, which is a theory also referred to as the Borromean knot, theory of subjectivity, of complex subjectivity, right? In some, the cogito, we can say, is the symptomatic or symptomatic nodal point around which those three dimensions, i.e. the real, symbolic, and imaginary, turn, the point that pushes subjectivity first beyond the imaginary I, then beyond the symbolic subject. So we can here look at this distinction between, thinking and being in relation to this developmental logic within psychoanalysis, from alienation to separation to traversing of fantasy. So this kind of developmental logic has to do with that all of us as divided subjects, as subjects of the signifier, as subjects of the unconscious, all of us are alienated because we have entered into language, a system that basically we didn't create, that has existed before us, and which pretty much informs a lot of what we do. So we feel basically castrated from a psychoanalytic perspective. So that's the alienation experience. And Lacan uses a good example to illustrate this. A thief comes to you and they tell you your money or your life. What do you think you will choose? Right? If you say, well, I'll pick my money, you will die. But if you pick your life, you lose your money. So in both cases, you lose. So it's a forced choice. Alienation is a forced choice. So it's not like you do have a choice. The choice has been in a way pre-decided. And so basically, this choice between life and money is also the choice between cogito and sum. So between being and thinking, we'll always pick thinking. Okay, the same way that we've picked life over money. However, there's a way of kind of moving from alienation or beyond alienation to separation. And this movement is kind of is described at the bottom here. So alienation would be kind of conceiving of the subject as demand. So the alienated subject is dominated by the non-meaning of the master signifier. And so this means that the big other, symbolized by the capital A here, basically is this as a field of speech, as a representative of the symbolic order and law, is a castrating agency, and we feel, kind of helpless, right? So this experience of alienation is something that we all go through early on in life, typically from a Freudian perspective in relation to the father figure. But the father, just one representative, ultimately in life, it's whatever that big other is for you. So the subject as desire, that would be the separation, is lured by the unconscious nonsense of fantasy. So if you were to if let's say you were frustrated with your alienation and you decide to seek an analyst, ultimately what they're trying to do is to move you from alienation to separation, right? So they want you to, instead of trying to find meaning in the big other and master signifiers, they'll have you reflect more on your unconscious and what kind of fantasies you might have. So that's kind of the move there. So focusing more on desire, right? What is your desire? What is it that you want? Okay, stop complaining about the big other. Well, this happened, that's done. Now, what do you want, right? And that's a hard question to articulate because a lot of the time we don't know what we want. In fact, if we do know, we might be disturbed. That's kind of the psychoanalytic lesson. The desire is unconscious, right? So that's why it's difficult to talk about it. That's why it's difficult to even know it. So we might say things like, I don't know, for that reason. Once you say, I don't know, that says something about the unconscious. The sort of final phase, supposedly, that you reach that, then you're done with analysis, then you can become an analyst, supposedly, right? As the subject is drive. And that's the traversal of fantasy. So at this stage, you're subjectifying the cause of your existence. In other words, you're reconfiguring enjoyment in relation to your symptoms. So a lot of times we have symptoms. That's why we seek the clinic. And we think that what we want to do is change our symptoms. But the problem is that we're addicted to our symptoms. This is something that's hard for us to face. But that's usually what we find out quite quickly in the clinic, right? It's not that you want to change the symptom, it's that you enjoy it, but it's also a big source of pain, because enjoyment from a psychoanalytic perspective means pain and pleasure at the same time. So in a way, I'm trying to show you this kind of developmental logic that takes place in psychoanalysis in relation to cogito ergo sum and how they are related, right? It starts with that logic of alienation. The subject of psychoanalysis, I would argue, is not a universal subject. It's posited as such, but in my opinion, it is not. So Delar asks, is there an unconscious outside of cogito? He answers in the negative following Lacan. So for him, again, if you go back to what Zizek said, the cogito, that's basically where we locate the subject of psychoanalysis, right? So anything outside of that is not the subject of psychoanalysis. So I'm interested in everything outside of that. I'm fine with the cogito, that's cool, but I don't think that's all there is, okay? So I answer in the affirmative. And so that's where I kind of developed this notion of the transmodern unconscious, which we can talk about later. They also make the argument that the subject of psychoanalysis is the subject of modern science. This Lacan makes that point. And Delar writes, for being empty, it can be universal. And it can indeed be seen as the form of subjectivity implied by science, a merely formal subjectivity. So again, I'm interested in the kind of subject that's excluded from this, right? Because this is being posited as the universal subject. Again, Freudian unconscious is the unconscious of the cogito. Delar then asks, how does the subject of the unconscious as cogito relate to jouissance or enjoyment? So I would like us to historicize this question in the context of European colonialism. So choosing being would entail desubjectivation. One would have to give up the status of the subject altogether. But apart from that, from Descartes' own point of view, choosing being would be void. It would thrust the subject back into the vagaries of the imaginary, a confusion without hope for foundation and consistency, the black hole of being outside rationality. So this is from Delar. My comment on that is that the alienation and non-being of the colonized subject is not a psychical metaphor, but a real historical materiality. Again, going back to this notion of symbolic slavery. In fact, one can argue that the cogito's literal assault on the being of non-Europeans is one of the key features of colonialism. So here we're thinking about this division between being and thinking, not just as a problem for the subject of psychoanalysis, but an actual historical material problem that can be historicized and thought about in a material way. This is from Zizek, talking again about modern subjectivity, the subject of psychoanalysis, the subject of modern science. If you notice, all of the references indicate that this subject is Christian, European, and man. Now, this is published in 1998, so it's not like back then you couldn't refer to men and women and, so it's not an ancient text from the, from where people refer to man to refer to the universal human being, right? So again, let's think about these references, the Renaissance, man, Erasmus, Luther, all of these indications about what kind of subject this is. Again, it's not a universal subject, right? So think about what I just said in terms of historicizing this problem in view of what I'm going to show now, which are the 4 genocides, epistemicides in the long 16th century. This is from Gross-Fogel. So the first genocide, epistemicide, was against Muslims and Jews in the conquest of Al-Andalus in the name of purity of blood. This idea was the Castilian king, basically, this whole concept of the reconquest is to purify this land that was, supposedly occupied by Muslims with the help of Jews. And this purification of blood means that only Christians are the pure ones, right? So you have this, this is before our modern understanding, scientific understanding of racism. You can say that this is kind of the beginning of religious racism as the foundation for racism in many ways, right? So now today, it's interesting, and you'll see in discourses, if people talk about racism against Muslims and Jews, people say, but you can't be racist against a religion. Well, that's how it started. So they were not seen as just people that have different religions. They were seen as different people, as lesser people, as impure. And then when they could, let's say some of them decided to stay in what is now called Spain and then became Christians, they will be in a separate category of lesser Christians. Okay, so we're never equal. This is the idea of purity of blood here. The second genocide, epistemicide against indigenous peoples, first in the Americas and then in Asia. The third one against African people with the captive trade and their enslavement in the Americas. The fourth one against women who practiced and transmitted Indo-European knowledge in Europe, burned alive, accused of being witches. Okay, so Gross-Fogel talks about these 4 genocides, epistemicides in the long 16th century. So I want you to keep them in mind as we're talking today. Now, superimpose this on the previous slide, what Zizek said, right? Modern subjectivity, Christian, European, man. And notice how that fits in juxtaposition to these 4 genocides, epistemicides, right? So those are the people excluded from modern universal subjectivity. Okay? These genocides, epistemicides, were essentially against peoples who were perceived as pre or non-modern. They were called savages, primitives, barbarians, in other terms. They are the irrational non-beings canceled by the Euro-modern cogito. Therefore, they are outside the category of the subject of modern science. They're outside the category of the subject of psychoanalysis. They're outside universality, if you will. Okay? So building on this, I argue that the colonial unconscious is the logic sustaining the rhetoric of the modern unconscious. This is what, and I call it the colonial unconscious because this is what psychoanalysts don't talk about. This is what psychoanalysis doesn't address, okay? And this work builds on other important works such as Dussell's The Invention of the Americas, Gross-Fogel. So Dussel made the argument that the ego cogito, this kind of ego developed on this notion of the cogito, has its foundation in the ego conquiro. Okay, and he says the I conquistador or I conqueror forms the proto-history of Cartesian ego cogito and constitutes its own subjectivity as will to power. So in other words, he's raising this question, problematizing the cogito that we take for granted as this kind of universal subjectivity associated with science and psychoanalysis and philosophy. How come it became this dominant key subjectivity? Well, there's a material and historical precedent for it, right? That's the part that's not theorized, that's not explored as much. This is what I want to shed light on. Gross-Fogel's intervention is to add kind of an intermediate ego extermino, and he writes, what links the I conquer, therefore I am, ego conquero from Dussel, with the idolatric, godlike, I think, therefore I am, ego cogito, is the epistemic racism, sexism produced from the I exterminate, therefore I am, ego extermino. it is the logic of genocide, epistemicide together that mediates the I conquer with the epistemic racism, sexism of the I think as the new foundation of knowledge in the modern colonial world. The ego extermino is the social, historical, structural condition that makes possible the link of the ego concuro with the ego cogito. Okay, and now we move on to the ego cogito. The Cartesian subject, and this is from Zizek, by the way, is the monster who remains when we subtract from the subject the wealth of self-experience that constitutes subjectivity. It's interesting that he describes the Cartesian subject as a monster based on this actual history. Again, they stay at the level of metaphor. I'm looking at history. I'm looking at this in a material way, right? So in other words, the Cartesian or modern subject is a dehumanizing subject who has not come to terms with the real of coloniality, for they deny the being and thinking of non-Europeans. And that's the central thesis right there, okay? Given the Cartesian or modern subject's foundation in coloniality, it's essential that we try and conceive of a transmodern subject from the perspective of decoloniality, because ultimately we have to kind of show the problem, what is missing, what is not included, what's excluded from the story that we tell ourselves, that is being told to us about ourselves. And then we have to tell our own story too, right? So that's important, is that we theorize another form of subjectivity, another form of otherness. And this is where the double unconsciousness plays in. And the model for me to follow, you can see I like a lot of these kind of representations. This is from Dussel. His points here, to kind of simplify, so he has the modern system on the left. So that's what we can call modernity. The Cartesian cogito would be central there. Psychoanalysis is founded upon that. Philosophy is all located there. So that's the modern system. And then we have what's exterior to it. And this notion of exteriority is interesting because, again, I want to think that following, Dussel and Said and others, exterior doesn't mean that it's necessarily outside. It means that it's excluded more than that it's outside. Okay, and so the reason we say that is because for Dussel, this notion of transmodernity actually includes modernity. So it's actually a bigger picture of the world. It's looking at the world from the perspective of the non-European world, from the perspective of the oppressed, and trying to conceive of or visualize or prefigure a more global, more just world. Okay, so all the kind of cultures, languages, peoples that have been oppressed, excluded, exterminated, conquered, etc., that are exterior to modernity, that are not included in the writings and the important texts, are not one of the names that we study in PhDs in philosophy or MAs in philosophy, right? The point of transmodernity for Dussel is we start from the exterior of modernity as a form of critique, but it's a kind of critique that comes from a loving place. And this echoes a lot of Freire too, Paulo Freire. So it does something that's different from, let's say, critical modernism, which would be exemplified by the Frankfurt School. So it's a critique of modernity from within. It does something different from postmodernity, which kind of sits at the edge of modernity, but doesn't do more than that. And he shows it there. The A, you can see postmodernity, the limit of modernity. So transmodernity offers an alternative to modernity, critical modernity, and postmodernity. And so, again, in a way, the way I see it is that it's a really bigger picture of the world that starts from a different place, but ultimately includes everyone, right? So it offers a different vision of the human, of subjectivity. It offers a more humanizing way of thinking about subjectivity, in my opinion. That's different from the cogito, which I think is tainted. It has that kind of dehumanizing subjectivity. So it's tainted. And if we pretend that it's not tainted, we just further the problem. And that's why here we are in the 21st century and look at the problems in the world. Why is that the case, right? Why do we continue to have these kinds of problems? Yeah, sure, we can say we don't have, slavery anymore, but there are other forms of slavery that continue to exist, including human trafficking, right? So colonialism continues to exist. So it continues to inform modernity. And by the way, for the decolonial school of thought, they always think of coloniality as the kind of underside of modernity. So the two are interlinked in a dialectical way. So you can't think really modernity without coloniality. So the solution to this is not to say F modernity and let's do something else. That's not the idea. This idea is, what can we do that's inclusive of the best of modernity, but also includes all the things that are really cool that were excluded by modernity, all the people, all the ideas, all the practices, right? So that's kind of a summary of this conception. So non-Europeans and a further division of divided subjectivity. And by the way, if you look at Freud and Lacan, because that's where you get this notion of divided subjectivity. Obviously, Freud famously said, "Wo es war, soll ich werden," where it was, I must come into being. Again, referring to division. And Lacan revised Descartes, saying, "I am thinking where I am not, therefore I am where I'm not thinking." Again, to understand this, it sounds like a koan or something. Go back to that Venn diagram that I showed, where thinking and being are separated. There's that alienation. This kind of idea exists also in the non-European world, in non-European systems of thought. So Thich Nhat Hanh, from a Buddhist perspective, talks about, "I think, therefore I'm not," echoing Lacan in many ways. Maghrebi philosopher Abdelkabir Khatibi talks about other thought, because I'm interested in thinking outside of the cogito, right? And then Mignolo builds on that, talks about an other thinking. And Paget Henry talks about Caliban's reason. There is a reason exterior to modernity, right? So to say that there's something that is exterior to modernity, the typical kind of racist response would be to think of it as pre-modern, right? To put it on a developmental logic. Oh, that came before, this is traditional. Now we have, culture, we have civilization, but what you're talking about, that's in the past, right? That's primitive. But the point here that Henry makes and others as well is that this other thinking exterior to the cogito is also a form of reasoning that is as valid as modernity, right? But that hasn't been included in as such. So how am I doing on time?
You're good, just keep going.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to go through some kind of tools that could be helpful for us in a positive way, so that we don't just look at the critique and how oppressed people are seen from the perspective of modernity, but also try to think with people from the global south, with non-European thinkers and theorists, etc., of this other thinking. So Abdelkabir Khatibi is a Maghrebi philosopher, and he talks about other thought. And so I'll show you some interesting quotes from him. He, first of all, thinks of other thought as planetary and plural. He writes, "What is necessary, the duty of an other thought, is to broaden our freedom to think, to introduce in all dialogue several strategic levers. For example, to eliminate from discourse the absolutes of theology and theocentrism, which shackle the time, space, and edifice of Maghrebi societies. But this is not enough. The dialogue with all thought of difference is monumental. It aims to unsettle all that stupefies us in repetition and reproduction. And other thought is always a plot, a conspiracy, a perpetual revolt. and a relentless risk, and we are so defenseless in the face of the power of the world. Such is our history, which will have struck the body. Now, it's interesting to kind of look at Khatibi's work as one example, and I look at other examples too, because Sarah Ahmed, for example, talks about politics of citation, which I think is an important idea. That who do we cite in our work? Who are the thinkers that we think with, right? Are we just repeating the myth of modernity, citing the same thinkers and theorists over and over, or are we thinking outside of our comfort zone, which is hopefully what we're doing, right? To unsettle. Another thought, he adds, analyzing itself in the words and laws that ground and bear it, works to penetrate the question of non-power on the one hand, and on the other to try to go beyond this opposition power and non-power toward a research that would erase itself at the margins of metaphysics. To be decolonized would be the other name of this other thought, and decolonization would be the silent completion of Western metaphysics. And this is where begins this third speech, this unbinding of Western reason and its sciences and techniques. How can this researcher bear in himself the third world, which is a plural question, within a thought that must accept the overturn of all values and hierarchies? Insurgency is an exigency of life and of survival. Once again, there is no choice, endless debate, let us make a leap. That is why this other thought that we uphold is neither Marxist in the strict sense nor anti-Marxist in the right-wing sense of the word, but stands at the limits of its possibilities. For we seek to decenter in us Western knowledge, to decenter ourselves with respect to this center, this origin that the West gives itself. This should be done by operating already in the field of a plural and planetary thought difference that struggles against its own reduction and domestication. And another thought, such as we envisage it, is a thought in tongues, a globalizing translation of the codes, systems, and constellations of signs that circulate in the world and above in a non-theological sense. The margin is actually a blind limit. The double critique consists in opposing to the Western episteme its unthought of outside, while radicalizing the margin, not only in a thought in Arabic, but also in other thoughts that speaks in tongues, listening to every word from wherever it comes. This other thought, this as yet unnameable, is perhaps a promise, the sign of a happening in a world to be transformed. Doubtless an endless task. However, in thought, let us call it thus. There are no miracles, only ruptures. So again, a lot of interesting kind of methodological tools here, theoretical tools for thinking this other thinking, which we can think of as exterior to the cogito, right? Paget Henry has also important contributions. Let me turn on my lights, excuse me. So Paget Henry's wonderful book, Caliban's Reason, he writes, this was no ordinary capital labor relation. Faust, the capitalist developer, was here metamorphosed into Prospero. And he's referencing, of course, Shakespeare's The Tempest, while his racialized worker was transformed into Caliban. This Calibanization of Africans could not but devour their rationality, and hence their capacity for philosophical thinking. As a biological being, Caliban is not a philosopher. He or she does not think, and in particular does not think rationally. In the European tradition, rationality was a white trait that by their exclusionary racial logic, Blacks could not possess. Hence, the inability to see the African now reinvented as Caliban in the role of sage, philosopher, or thinker. In short, this new racialized identity was also the death of Caliban's reason. So what Henry tries to do is to resurrect Caliban's reason, show us that what is thought of as unreason, from the perspective of modernity, because that's what they'll always tell us, is actually a form of reasoning that's equally valid, if not more valid, given the ethical dimension, actually. He talks about different sources of inspiration. C.L.R. James, he talks how in James, the corresponding formulation could be and this is in reference to a reply to Descartes. I undertake or participate in a historical project, therefore I am. Okay. This socially constructed nature of the Jamesian self will find some significant echoes in traditional African thought. Also, in this tradition, the thinking or speaking subject was not conceived on the solitary Cartesian model. On the contrary, as Mbiti suggests, it is more a case of I am because we are, and since we are, therefore I am. So again, if we go back to Cartesian cogito and the kind of neoliberalism that we have today and these notions of individualism, where does that come from? And what are the implications of that kind of thinking, right? Another source of inspiration, of course, is Sylvia Wynter. Vulnerability via the necessary misrepresentation of liminal categories is the dynamic principle of epistemic change for Wynter. Because of these categories, discourse production is accompanied by the creating of a shadow that will eventually lead to the downfall of the discourse. Wynter's new vertical drama of cogito consciousness is to make explicit this process of shadow creation through the analysis of the liminal categories of epistemes. And you can think here that she's thinking about the double unconscious in many ways. By making discursive shadow production explicit, Wynter hopes to introduce a qualitatively new type of episteme, one that would give us greater control over the misrepresentations that have undermined horizontal projects of emancipation. Our third and final concern with Wynter's position is its reformulation of the vertical drama of ego consciousness as one of cogito consciousness. That is, whether or not as human beings we will be able to increase significantly our consciousness of and control over the autopoietic processes that ground our discursive practices. So this is what she's interested in. And again, this is what I'm interested in thinking about this other thinking, right? Ultimately, the possibilities for an African philosophy rests upon our ability to affirm the operating of African cultural registers and the egogenesis of African, Afro-American, and Afro-Caribbean philosophers. Without claiming the status of timeless essences, such affirmations would allow us to identify specific philosophical cogitos whose unique features are in part determined by the formative influences of African symbols and discourses. These formative experiences are ones that philosophers of African descent do not share with other philosophers. They are responsible in part for our uniqueness and our original voice. Again, these symbols and discourses are not timeless essences. On the contrary, they have been changed by different processes of hybridization and creolization. But like so many other sets of ego-forming symbols, they have a long half-life. So for me, because I've been working on this for maybe the past 5 years, a big source of inspiration, obviously, for me was Du Bois. He talks about two-ness and he talks about double consciousness. And so as someone who's interested in psychoanalysis, but who's also critical of it, I was interested in the implication of his model, because he talks, you read in my piece, he talks about this gift of second sight that's enabled by double consciousness for the racialized or the oppressed, in the sense that they're able to have two kinds of visions. They're able to see themselves from the perspective of the oppressor. They have this awareness, which unfortunately could function like a super ego, if you will, right? It's this constant awareness that, am I doing the right thing here? Am I in the right place, right? And of course, no matter how much you overthink that, it's never good enough, because we continue to see racist acts of violence today, right? So there's that awareness, but there's also this other awareness of their own experience. The oppressor, on the other hand, from Du Bois's perspective, doesn't have that gift of second sight. They only see things from their perspective, and that's it. That's why they're not able to empathize. They're not able to see things from another perspective. So my point is to kind of extend this idea, all the way to, psychoanalysis, and to think about this dynamic, maybe in relation to the clinic, and the relation between the analyst and the analysand, but also more socially in the relations between different subjects, particularly subjects who are more identified with Euromodernity versus subjects who are not, right? So it's kind of easy to go from his idea of double consciousness to this notion of double unconsciousness that I developed. So all of this, what I talked about, was basically exploring the subjective part. This last part about the two others is much shorter, so don't worry. I'm going to finish soon. So the two others and the resurrection of the other. This part a little bit is kind of a debate within Lacanian circles, so may not be as interesting. Let's see. Actually, so basically, to kind of summarize, Lacan, he had these different seminars, one every year, and a lot of them have been translated and transcribed and edited and available as books, etc. So in one seminar, he talks about the other of the other, and then in the next seminar, he then says there is no other of the other. So there's kind of a contradiction there. And then now, if you ask any Lacanian, they'll just say there is no other of the other. But I'm interested in the other of the other, right? Not necessarily in the way that Lacan thinks about it, but more in line with this notion of exteriority that we talked about, right? So as you can see here, for Lacan, modern science relies on an anomalous Judeo-Christian tradition, which is no longer preoccupied with what goes on in the celestial domain, but rather secures the other to a non-deceptive a priori, which is itself symbolic. This is nothing but Descartes' non-deceiving God. I'm showing you this because, again, the centrality of Cartesian philosophy to psychoanalysis and the centrality of the cogito for this understanding of the universal subject. So for us to think about an other subject, we have to think of an other of the other. And actually, the way I came across this, because actually I explored this a little bit in my first book, Decolonial Psychoanalysis, which is a qualitative study that deals with how US Muslims account for their experiences with Islamophobia, but also how they resist Islamophobia. And what I noticed interviewing 19 participants is I noticed shifts in the discourse when they're US Muslims, so that's already a hyphenated subjectivity, if you will, right? And so when they're thinking in terms of their Muslim subjectivity, they often will say Arabic phrases and refer to Arabic words and concepts related to Islam. So there's that, and then there's another kind of subjectivity that's in English that's related to the US and all of that, being US citizens. So I found that interesting, and that's when I started to think about this double unconsciousness and that further division that's never really accounted for by traditional analysts, right, or psychoanalytic theorists. So I go through all of this ultimately, and even this is Lacan talks about how modernity is founded historically, and pre-modernity is founded retroactively on a symbolic other of the other, and how this other of the other is tied to Aristotelian science and Descartes, the Judeo-Christian God. So it's the references again are very specific. They're echoed by Zizek and others. A central thing for Lacan's conception of the other is, for him, the other of the other is basically the name of the Father, particularly the name of the primordial Father. In French, it's le nom du Père, which sounds like no as well as name. So it has that double meaning. And he actually liked that because, as you know, psychoanalysts like these kind of language games. So the basic law of the prohibition of incest is what one discovers at the root of any historically determined other of the other. The universal other of the other, or the name of the Father, is Lacan's mythical equivalent to Freud's Oedipus complex. So it's a way for him to theorize historical development and think about that. But I'll get into why he ends up kind of reversing his position. So he ends up arguing that there is no other of the other in the subsequent seminar, because he's saying that there is no meta language. There is no symbolic without the real, and vice versa, right? That's the reason why he moved that. So in a way, he wanted to kind of move away a little bit from structuralism, a structuralist account, to an account that can explain enjoyment and jouissance, which are hard to fit perfectly on a kind of symbolic grid. That's why he was trying to come to terms with, because he's returning to Freud's project using the insights from linguistic anthropology, all kinds of structuralist theories, as well as mathematics, set theory, and trying to return to Freud with this emphasis on language. But then he realized that he hit kind of a limit with language. He had to kind of think about the real in relation to the symbolic, but also what cannot be symbolized at the same time, right? So Lacan's, I'm going fast through this part because I don't want to talk too much and leave space more for conversation. Lacan's problem with this structuralist account is that the other of the other presupposes a purely external real. So this is this visualization is from Lorenzo Chiesa. You can see the subject is the barred S. There's symbolic speech, the kind of speech that we use, which would be unconscious in the clinic. And then the symbolic as language, the kind of system that houses our speech. And the name of the father is kind of the thing that holds this together, kind of a separation between these two levels of the symbolic. And that the pure real is somehow outside of all of this. So that's why he decides there's a problem with the other of the other, because the real is outside and this separation is too neat. So he ends up saying there is no other of the other. But I want to resurrect this idea of the other for other purposes, mainly to think about other subjectivity, right? So here's a question for us. Doesn't the colonial subject presuppose a purely external or barbarian real outside of modernity, an exotic real source of infinite jouissance, i.e. non-European lands and peoples that can be extracted from, exploited, accumulated, etc. Again, I'm trying to historicize and think about this in a material way. In sum, the modern other is the universal name of the father par excellence. So that's why I argue for actually a return to this notion of the other, because it fits really well if we look at the historical account and actually the logic that informed Lacan's thinking, going from Aristotle to Descartes, etc. So my argument is that I agree with Lacan that there is no meta language, but my argument is that there is an other system exterior to modernity, which is negated by it. This is the argument that Dussel makes. He doesn't make it from a psychoanalytic perspective. I just try to think about it in a psychoanalytic way in order to better explain the relevance and application of psychoanalysis, especially for non-European subjectivities, because that's what I'm interested in ultimately, right? So given in my view, psychoanalysis without qualification basically is dealing with post-colonial or colonial subjectivity and a postmodern or modern other. But we have to do a little bit of more of legwork, a little bit more of theoretical work to get to a decolonial subjectivity and to think about transmodern otherness. And to do that, we need this concept of double unconscious in order to make that move. Okay. So this graph on the right here, it's something that I produced for my book, Freud and Said, called the apparatus of racialized capitalism. In many ways, this is based on, Gray Mash's work, but which is based on Aristotle's work. But basically, what I try to account for is to make a distinction between the zone of being and zone of non-being. So you have the top part is the zone of being. Psychoanalysis, as it exists today, and we can say philosophy as well, operates in the zone of being, and basically doesn't have a lot to contribute in terms of the zone of non-being. Of course, there are psychoanalysts that have done this, like Fanon and others, and we need more of that. And of course, it's cool that Fanon actually is quite popular today. But we need more work in this area. So a central conception for psychoanalysis is this notion of sexual difference, the difference between masculine jouissance, masculine enjoyment, and feminine enjoyment. They don't think about it in terms of biological distinction or cultural distinction, but they think about it in terms of a difference in jouissance. So that kind of sexuation, the logic of sexuation, is a logic of jouissance. So for me, I see sexual difference again as being very much applicable in the zone of being. But I think my point is that colonial difference, which has to do with historical colonialism, ongoing colonialism, as well as coloniality, basically colonial difference is much more foundational and actually precedes from a historical perspective. If you all go back to ego concuro, ego extermino, ego cogito, so that's kind of thinking about that trajectory. The colonial difference is at the foundation of sexual difference. So to think about that means to think about basically the underside of psychoanalysis, to think about the unconscious of psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis here could be replaced by any other discipline really from modernity. It just happens to be the thing that I study, right? So this model basically accounts for how colonial difference is at the basis of sexual difference, and account for oppression in terms of the axes of class struggle, as well as racism, as well as sexism. So how the three kind of, and it's so you have, and this notion of the man not and woman not at the bottom, and the zone of non-being actually builds on the work of Tommy Curry, his conception of the man not, and that's something we can get into. But basically, that's the main idea here. This other system is the basis for another subjectivity, a transmodern decolonial subjectivity, and there's the possibility of exploring that, and that's what I try to do in my work. So I'll stop here.
Okay, I guess I'll open up the floor for questions. I guess if anyone wants to use like the raise hand feature or something, and also feel free if you don't want to talk to just throw a question in the chat, and I can read it out. But yeah, let me know if anyone has any questions for Dr. Bashara.
I know it's a lot, so, and I went through the last part pretty quickly, but I didn't want to overwhelm you too.
I'll shoot if no, is anyone, am I jumping ahead of anyone?
Nope, go for it.
Okay, so a few things. Like I want to say excellent talk, great talk, and thank you so much for taking time out with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And also excellent introduction to very difficult psychoanalytic concepts as well, right? And it's also a very ambitious project, I think, too, to try to meld such two disparate fields, right? Which is it's so expansive what's trying to be included in this very limited model that you're criticizing. So that's very formidable part of it as well. But because I want to push on the philosophy a little bit, if you don't mind, and or some of the psychoanalysis rather. And it seems like there's like a tension in it between the material and the logic, right? And so I'm gonna try to go to both and see. I might mess this up, so please correct me, right? So it seems that on the one hand, one of the arguments is that that the material that there's a tradition, the Western tradition, that ignores the materiality of slavery, right? And that's very, and that helps me understand the part in the reading about the problems with the logic of psychoanalysis, right? But it seems that there are aspects of psychoanalysis that will speak to that, right? Like where you know, even though this is up in the air, the materiality of the signifier, right? Or after 1968, when there was critiques about Lacan's structuralism, and he says my structuralism marches in the streets, or even like that's very even these are kind of like tendential, but the fact that all humans have to come through language, right, is a material fact of psychoanalysis that is in a sense universal in this way, or the fact that we're born and we can't take care of ourselves. So as neonates, never mind man or woman, sex man, cis man or woman, there is this neonatal kind of helplessness that is a part of the materiality, right? And it seems then like that the logic of psychoanalysis kind of embodies itself in the